The back and forth between the cruise lines and the CDC continued last week as the cruise lines and its opponents made public statements regarding resuming cruising in the United States. But the CDC remained quiet while both sides were battling it out in social media and the press. How will all of this end? Well, we take a detailed look at all of the recent developments to analyze when we will actually get to cruise again here in the US. Hey everyone, I'm DB from Eat Sleep Cruise, where we help you see the world one port at a time with our latest reviews, tips, and cruise updates. Now, it's Sunday, almost 2 full weeks since Norwegian Cruise Line Holdings submitted its Sail Safe proposal to the CDC. And guess what? The CDC has yet to respond. Of course, we're not the only ones to notice this lack of acknowledgement. On Thursday, the company's chairman and CEO, Frank Del Rio, sent a reminder letter to the CDC. Yes, you heard me correctly. The company that owns Norwegian Cruise Line, Regent Seven Seas, and Oceania Cruises had to remind the CDC that they sent a formal request to resume cruising in the United States back on April 5th. In this more recent gentle nudge of the CDC, NCLH requested a response from the CDC to the company's previously submitted plan to resume cruise operations from US ports by July 4th. Now, in this bold proposal, the company strongly believes that by requiring mandatory vaccinations for guests and crew on initial voyages, in addition to comprehensive safety protocols, which include universal COVID-19 testing, the plan goes well beyond the spirit and the intent of the Conditional Sailing Order. According to the cruise company, the Sail Safe program extends well beyond the protocols of the travel, leisure, and hospitality sectors, all of which have already reopened. Now, this includes things like hotels and resorts, casinos, restaurants, sporting events, theme parks, and of course the airlines. Despite the fact that Norwegian Cruise Line Holdings hasn't heard from the CDC, they still remain optimistic that the organization will agree that the current plan eliminates the need for the framework for Conditional Sailing Order. In the second letter, CEO and Chairman Del Rio did not mince words. While championing the company's approach and its commitment to the safety and security of its guests, crew, and the communities the cruise lines visit, you can tell that the chairman was certainly agitated. In his response, he said he was frustrated that it had been close to 2 weeks and the company had yet to receive even an acknowledgement of this proposal. Of course, he was careful to acknowledge that the CDC has several public health issues to oversee and respond to during the global pandemic. Yet, he was following up now as he believed the cruise company's proposal should be the model for how the travel and hospitality industries operate in a COVID-19 environment. In his letter, Del Rio referenced the meeting earlier in the week with CDC and cruise officials. He also pointed out that the Sail Safe program was not even mentioned during that meeting. While trying to be polite, it's very evident that Del Rio does not see these meetings as being productive. He went on to write that he understands the industry may have regular meetings with the CDC, but he remained concerned that such meetings produce non-existent results that they have seen since last year. Now, that is pretty bold to essentially call out the CDC. In essence, he's finally putting some pressure on the organization to actually work with the cruise lines. Not just put out unrealistic orders and regulations, but to have an open dialogue where the parties work together to come up with a plan to resume cruising. As we've mentioned before, we assumed that this backdoor dealing was already occurring between the cruise line and the health organization. With the release of the technical instructions about 2 weeks ago, it became very apparent that the two sides were not collaborating and partnering with one another. Do you think the CDC will finally give in? Let us know in the comment section below if you think the Conditional Sailing Order will finally be changed and that cruising will resume here in the US by July. Now, the meeting Del Rio referenced in his letter between the cruise lines, cruise industry stakeholders, the CDC, and other government agencies didn't come to light until later in the week, when several outlets began reporting that this meeting actually occurred. On Thursday, CLIA, the professional organization that represents 95% of the cruise lines, sent a letter to its executive partners detailing this virtual listening session that occurred between the industry stakeholders and the CDC about the framework for Conditional Sailing Order. According to this update, During the meeting, the cruise industry reiterated its claims that the current order does not permit for a resumption of cruising this July, despite the CDC's insistence that it does. Last week, several spokespeople from the CDC made comments indicating that under the current regulations, cruise line operations could resume as early as July. During this listening session, CLIA reports that the cruise lines again requested that the current framework be replaced or significantly altered. Now, this meeting did seem to be productive, as according to reports, the cruise industry felt their concerns were finally heard and recognized by the government officials in attendance. This also gave the cruise industry the opportunity to highlight several of the protocols that have been put in place all over the globe where cruising has resumed. Some of these protocols include testing, prevention measures, and onboard response systems when cases are detected. Perhaps the most frustrating issue in all of this back and forth the last couple weeks is the CDC's failure to acknowledge that over 400,000 cruise passengers have successfully sailed using these health and safety measures, and the result of those sailings is that COVID-19 transmission rates are much lower at sea than they are here on land. During this meeting, the cruise officials were also able to offer their views on why the current Conditional Sailing Order is outdated. Along with not keeping up with international standards, it's also founded on highly unlikely scenarios, and it does not incorporate current medical advances in things such as testing and vaccines. While the CDC hasn't come out and formally acknowledged this meeting or provided any updates, according to CLIA, the CDC did report that they are committed to working with the cruise industry and will evaluate the changes in science and the impact vaccines could have on a responsible restart to cruising this summer. Now, that sounds good in theory, but it seems really late in the game for these conversations to just be starting. These conversations should have been happening months ago, especially once the vaccine started rolling out and showing success in fighting COVID-19. So even though that's some positive news, we're essentially where we were last week because no action has been taken. In fact, CLIA pointed out to its executive partners, the cruise lines need to know the regulations and protocols by May if they're going to cruise here in the US by this summer. There also didn't appear to be any next steps or guidance following this meeting. It could be possible that both sides are working behind the scenes, and soon there'll be a joint statement released regarding the future of cruising here in the US. But that is questionable given Frank Del Rio's letter a few days later asking the CDC to give him a response. Now, could this letter just be kind of a media stunt or a way to pressure the CDC to cave and offer new guidelines? It's also worth noting that on Thursday, Norwegian Cruise Line released the first episode in its docuseries Embark, which details the company's return to cruising, featuring all the new developments, technology, and safety protocols they're implementing across their fleet in several different areas, such as food and beverage and the guest experience. Now, to make things more interesting, several lawmakers last week also got involved in discussions. Now, you may remember 2 weeks ago, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis sued the CDC over the Conditional Sailing Order. Well, on Tuesday of last week, Florida Senators Rick Scott, Marco Rubio, and Alaska Senator Dan Sullivan introduced a new bill to allow cruising to restart. The aptly named Careful Resumption Under Improved Safety Enhancements, or CRUISE Act, is set to get cruising resumed here in the US by the summer. Well, it's not surprising that the new CRUISE Act would revoke the CDC's current no-sail order on cruises. The act would call for a switch in the CDC's role and oversight of the return to cruising. This legislation would require the CDC to issue recommendations for how to mitigate the risks of COVID-19 to passengers and crew on board cruise ships. It would also establish an interagency working group that will develop recommendations to facilitate the resumption of passenger cruise ship operations in the United States. The recommendations will facilitate the resumption of passenger cruise ship operations no later than July 4th. Still, it would ensure that the Health and Human Services and the Center for Disease Control retains all the appropriate authorities to make and enforce regulations necessary to prevent the introduction, transmission, or spread of communicable diseases on any individual cruise ship. Now, in response to that legislation, on Thursday, just days after the bill was introduced, additional legislators urged the CDC to take aggressive action against cruise ships. Congresswoman Doris Matsui and U.S. Senator Richard Blumenthal appear to be doing what they can to ensure that cruising does not resume anytime soon from the United States. These lawmakers sent a letter to the CDC's director, urging her to strictly enforce the recently issued safety guidance under the Framework for Conditional Sailing Order, and immediately halt cruises if outbreaks occur on board. In this letter, the Congresswoman and Senator claim that prematurely lifting restrictions on cruising, with thousands of people in close proximity and conditions ripe for spread of infections, could create a serious setback in the US's progress towards beating the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, these two lawmakers have no love lost for cruising. Together, they are the lead sponsors of the Cruise Passenger Protection Act. So it's not surprising that they would issue the statement, disregarding all of the evidence demonstrating that cruising can return safely. This letter blatantly ignores all of the findings from sailings in other parts of the world that have been successful. Now, to be fair, the CDC has not yet responded to this letter, at least publicly yet. So now we're at a standstill, waiting to see what the CDC will do given the current conditions. The CDC knows the science. They know the cruise line's willingness to implement sound and sensible health and safety measures. Honestly, what more could the CDC ask or want? The CSO is definitely outdated, and as it stands now, US citizens can leave the country to go on a cruise. The CDC issued travel guidance for those who decide to take cruises outside of the US, even indicating that vaccinated passengers, when they return, do not need to quarantine. So why do we have to go to the Bahamas, Jamaica, or another Caribbean island to cruise when we can easily sail from some of the most popular ports in the world right here in the US? And that is the latest CDC Cruise update of when we're really going to get to sail. Now, if you found that video useful, we have tons of other videos here reviewing the situation between the CDC and the cruise lines, including all the changes you can expect to see on cruise ships due to COVID-19. Now, if you're thinking of taking one of these summer 2021 cruises that originate outside the US, before you book, you're going to want to watch our recent video all about our experience booking 3 of these cruises, where we detail everything you need to know about these initial sailings. Make sure to also subscribe to the channel below and to hit the notification icon. That way you get updated each week when we put out brand new cruise and travel videos. If you have a question or just want to say hi, reach out to us all over social media at Eat Sleep Cruise. We'd love to hear from you.